My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old, and sitting in the cold, sterile office of my late father's lawyer was supposed to be a simple formality. Instead, it became the moment my entire reality shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The lawyer handed me a small tarnished brass key, stating it was the only specific item my dad insisted I receive personally. My hands trembled as I drove back to my childhood home, marching straight up to the attic where an old cedar chest had sat locked for as long as I could remember. The key slid into the lock with a heady click. Inside, beneath layers of dust and old tax documents, was a wooden box. When I pried it open, there was no treasure, no family heirloom, just a single yellowed envelope with my name written in a handwriting I did not recognize. The paper felt fragile as I unfolded it, and the very first line made the air leave my lungs. It said, "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, I pray you can forgive me for leaving, but your father gave me no choice." The tears blurred my vision as I realized the woman who raised me was not my mother, and the man I mourned had hidden a monstrous secret that was about to change absolutely everything. Before I dive into the depths of this nightmare and how I uncovered the truth, I want to pause for a second. I am sharing this deeply personal journey because I know I am not alone in dealing with family secrets, and I would love to know where you are listening from right now. Drop your city or state in the comments because it brings me comfort to know my voice is reaching people all across the country. Now, to make you understand the sheer gravity of that letter, I need to take you back to how my life looked before that brass key turned my world upside down. I grew up in a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania, the only child of Thomas and Linda. My dad, Thomas, was a respected high school principal who passed away at the age of 68 after a sudden heart attack. He was the pillar of our community, a man who commanded respect and exuded authority. My mother, Linda, who was now 66 years old, was the quintessential homemaker. She baked for school bake sales, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and always made sure my dresses were perfectly ironed. To the outside world and to me, we were the perfect American family. There was never a whisper of scandal, never a raised voice that suggested any cracks in our foundation. Losing my dad was the hardest thing I had ever faced. The funeral was a blur of black suits, casseroles, and endless condolences. Linda played the role of the grieving widow flawlessly. She wept delicately into a tissue, leaning on my arm for support while the entire town paid their respects. I spent the weeks following his death staying at her house, cooking for her, making sure she took her medication, and putting my own grief on hold to be the strong daughter they had raised me to be. I never suspected that the woman weeping on my shoulder was harboring a lie so deep it would eventually destroy the very fabric of our relationship. The day I went to the lawyer's office, Linda stayed home. She said she could not bear to hear the legal terms, that it made my dad's death too real. So I went alone. Mr. Davis, a 70-year-old attorney who had known my family for decades, read through the standard distribution of assets, the house, the savings, the cars. It was all very standard until the very end when he pulled that brass key from a manila envelope. He looked at me with a strange expression, a mix of pity and confusion, and told me Thomas had brought the key in 5 years ago with strict instructions. Only I was to have it, and only after he was gone. Sitting on the dusty floorboards of the attic, holding that yellowed letter, I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I read the words again and again, trying to make sense of the impossible. The letter was signed by a woman named Elena. She wrote that she had given birth to me when she was just 19 years old. She described my tiny fingers, the small birthmark on my left shoulder, and the way I used to quiet down only when she hummed a specific lullaby. It was a lullaby I still caught myself humming when I was stressed, a melody I thought I had made up in my head. Elena's words painted a horrifying picture of my father. She explained that she had been a college student working at a local diner when she met Thomas. He was older, charming, and manipulative. When she got pregnant, she was terrified. Thomas promised to help her, but instead, he and his wife Linda, who had been struggling with infertility for years, orchestrated a nightmare. Elena wrote that Thomas threatened to use his influence and wealth to prove she was an unfit mother. He told her she would lose me to the foster system if she did not sign the papers and walk away forever. The letter detailed how Linda was entirely complicit. Linda had visited Elena in the hospital, standing over her bed with cold eyes, handing her a pen and a stack of legal documents. They gave her a small sum of money and a bus ticket out of state. Elena wrote that she fought, she screamed, she tried to go to the police, but Thomas had connections everywhere in our small town. No one believed the poor, desperate waitress over the respected high school principal. Broken and terrified, she left, but not before secretly leaving this letter in a box Thomas kept in his study, hoping one day I would find it. A physical wave of nausea washed over me. I dropped the paper as if it were on fire and scrambled backward, hitting my back against a stack of old cardboard boxes. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Every memory I had of Linda, brushing my hair, of Thomas teaching me how to ride a bike, felt tainted. It was all built on the destruction of a young woman's life. I was stolen. My entire existence in this house was a carefully constructed crime. The silence of the attic was deafening, broken only by my own ragged gasps for air. I knew I could not stay in that house a second longer. I folded the letter, shoved it into my purse along with the brass key, and practically ran down the attic stairs. Linda was in the kitchen, humming cheerfully as she arranged flowers in a vase. She looked up, offering me a warm, motherly smile that now looked terrifyingly sinister to me. She asked if everything went well with the lawyer.
I forced a nod, mumbled something about needing air, and rushed out the front door before she could notice the sheer panic radiating from my eyes. I drove blindly for miles until I reached the parking lot of a rundown diner on the edge of town. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely put the car in park. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I trusted in the world, my best friend, Mark, a 35-year-old mechanic who had known me since middle school. He answered on the second ring, his cheerful voice a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside me. I told him I needed him right now and that it was an emergency. He did not ask questions. He just told me to stay put. 20 minutes later, Mark's worn-out truck pulled up next to my car. He climbed into my passenger seat, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. When he saw my face, pale and streaked with mascara, his expression hardened into deep concern. I did not say a word. I just reached into my purse, pulled out the fragile yellowed minor, and handed it to him. I watched his eyes scan the page, darting back and forth as he processed the impossible words. The silence in the car stretched on for what felt like hours. When Mark finally looked up, his jaw was tight, and his eyes were wide with shock. He whispered my name, asking if this could possibly be real. I told him about the key, the lawyer, the hidden box in the attic, and the birthmark Elena mentioned. Mark knew about that birthmark. He knew about my lullaby. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in a sudden burst of anger, cursing Thomas and Linda for what they had done.
Seeing him angry validated everything I was feeling. I was not crazy. This was real and it was horrific. Mark looked me dead in the eye and asked what I wanted to do. Did I want to drive back to the house and tear the place apart? Did I want to confront Linda right then and there? I shook my head. Confronting Linda without more information would be a mistake. She was a master of appearances, a woman who had lied to my face every single day for 34 years. If I went to her now, she would deny it, call it a forgery, or manipulate the situation to make me feel like I was losing my mind. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to find Elena. The next morning, Mark and I started our investigation. I told Linda I was taking a few days to clear my head at a cabin upstate, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. We went straight to the county records office. The letter gave us Elena's full name, Elena Martinez, and the exact date. After hours of digging through microfilms and dealing with red tape, Mark found a faint copy of an original birth certificate. The mother was Elena Martinez, the father left blank. A few days later, an amended certificate was filed, replacing Elena with Linda, signed by a doctor who was my father's close golfing buddy. The corruption ran incredibly deep. Holding that paper made my knees weak. It was the physical proof I needed. Mark refused to let me stop there.
We spent the entire night huddled over his laptop in his messy living room, drinking stale coffee and searching online databases and property records. By 3 a.m., my eyes were burning, but Mark clicked on an old public directory listing. It showed an Elena Martinez who had lived in our zip code before moving to Ohio. We found a recent address linked to her in a small town near Cleveland. Mark simply closed the laptop, grabbed his car keys, and told me to get my coat. We were going to Ohio. The drive through the early morning hours was a blur of dark highways and heavy silence. I stared out the window, watching the landscape shift from familiar suburbs to endless fields. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions. What if she did not want to see me? What if she had moved on and forgotten about the baby she was forced to leave behind? What if she was not even alive anymore? Mark kept glancing at me, offering silent support, his presence the only thing keeping me anchored to reality as we crossed state lines into unknown territory. The sun was fully up by the time we reached the address in Ohio. It was a modest, single-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach tied itself into agonizing knots as we pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Mark gently touched my arm, telling me I did not have to do this alone. I took a deep, shuddering breath, opened the door, and stepped out onto the gravel. Every step toward the front door felt like walking through thick mud.
I reached out and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed inside the quiet house. A minute passed, then two. I was about to turn around, convinced we had the wrong place, when the door slowly opened. Standing before me was a woman who looked like an older reflection of myself. She had my dark hair, my hazel eyes, and the same slight curve to her jawline. She was Elena, now 53 years old, wearing a simple cardigan and looking at me with polite confusion. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up completely. I stood there, trembling, tears silently tracking down my face. Elena's polite smile faltered. She tilted her head, her eyes scanning my face, taking in my features. I saw the exact moment the realization hit her. All the color drained from her face. She raised a shaking hand to her mouth, letting out a choked, breathless gasp. She whispered my name, not as a question, but as a prayer she had been waiting decades to be answered. I nodded, unable to form words. Elena collapsed forward, wrapping her arms around me in a desperate, crushing embrace. I fell into her, burying my face in her shoulder, crying with an intensity that physically hurt. We stood on that porch for what felt like an eternity. Two strangers bound by blood and a stolen lifetime, mourning the years that had been violently ripped away from us. Mark stood a few feet back, respectfully giving us the space we needed to process the unimaginable weight of this reunion. Elena brought us inside and made tea with trembling hands. We sat at her small kitchen table, the air thick with emotion. I pulled the yellowed letter from my purse and placed it on the table. Elena touched the paper gently, tracing her own handwriting. She told me she had hidden it behind the baseboard in my father's study the night before she left, praying I would find it when I was old enough. She never imagined it would take 34 years, or that Thomas would be the one to eventually hand me the key to the truth. Over the next few hours, Elena filled in the agonizing gaps of my history. She told me how she had tried to fight back, how she had hired a cheap lawyer with the little money she had, but Thomas had systematically destroyed her credibility. He had the police chief in his pocket, the local judge on his side. They painted her as a drug addict, a liar, a danger to herself and her child. Linda had been the mastermind behind the emotional torture, calling Elena every night to remind her that she was nothing and that I deserved a real mother. Hearing the sheer malice in Linda's actions ignited a fire in my chest that burned away the remaining grief I had for my father. The man I mourned was a monster, and the woman I was supposed to comfort was his willing accomplice. Elena told me she had rebuilt her life, became a nurse, and never had other children. She said a piece of her soul had died the day she got on that bus, and she had spent every single birthday lighting a candle for the daughter she was not allowed to hold. I spent the rest of the day with Elena, sharing stories, showing her pictures of my life, and letting her finally be the mother she was meant to be. By the time evening approached, a cold, hard resolve had settled over me. I knew what I had to do. I hugged Elena goodbye, promising I would be back very soon, and that this was just the beginning for us. I got back into the car with Mark and told him to drive me back to Pennsylvania. It was time to tear down the perfect facade Linda had built. The drive back was different. The anxiety was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused anger. We arrived at my childhood home just as the sun was setting the next day. I told Mark to wait in the car. This was something I needed to do alone. I unlocked the front door and walked into the pristine hallway. The house smelled of lemon polish and vanilla candles, a sickeningly sweet mask over decades of rot. Linda was in the living room, watching television, a blanket draped over her lap. She smiled when she saw me. She asked how my trip to the cabin was, her voice dripping with that fake motherly concern. I did not answer. I walked slowly over to the coffee table and tossed the original birth certificate and the yellowed letter right in front of her. Linda looked down, her brow furrowing in confusion, before her eyes locked on Elena's handwriting. I watched the mask slip. The color vanished from her cheeks, her mouth opened and closed silently, and her hands began to shake violently. She knew exactly what she was looking at. I demanded the truth.
I told her I had found the box. I told her I had gone to Ohio. I told her I had looked my real mother in the eyes and heard every single detail of what she and Thomas had done. Linda tried to deny it at first. She stammered, claiming it was a lie, a fabrication from a crazy woman. But I did not let her speak. I raised my voice, the anger I had held back finally exploding. I recounted the threats, the fake doctor's signature, the bus ticket. I cornered her with her own crimes until she broke. Linda collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. But these were not the delicate, graceful tears of a grieving widow. These were the ugly, desperate tears of a woman whose entire life was collapsing. She screamed that she did it for me, that Elena was poor and could give me nothing, that she and Thomas provided me with a perfect life. She tried to grab my hands, begging me to understand that she loved me, that she was my real mother because she was the one who raised me. I pulled away as if she burned me. I looked down at the woman who had brushed my hair and kissed my scraped knees, and I felt absolutely nothing but disgust. I told her that love is not built on kidnapping and destruction. I told her she was a monster who stole a child to play house. I did not yell anymore. My voice was dangerously calm as I told her I was packing my things and leaving, and that she was never to contact me again.
I told her that if she ever tried to reach out, I would take the birth certificate and the letter straight to the local news. I walked up to my childhood bedroom and packed only the things I had bought myself. I left behind every gift, every reminder of the life they had funded with their lies. As I walked out the front door, Linda was on the floor in the hallway, begging me not to leave her all alone. I did not even look back. I walked out into the cool night air, threw my bags into Mark's truck, and told him to drive. For the first time in my 34 years, I felt like I was finally breathing real air. The consequences for Linda were severe, even without me going to the police. The statute of limitations on many of their crimes had passed, but small towns talk. I confided in a few key people, and the truth spread like wildfire. Linda lost her standing in the community. Her friends abandoned her, disgusted by the revelation of how she got her perfect family. She was forced to sell the big house and move away in disgrace, living the rest of her life in isolation and shame, exactly what she had condemned Elena to all those years ago. As for me, I moved to Ohio a few months later. Mark helped me pack up my apartment, and we drove the 5 hours together, this time with the windows down and music playing. I bought a small house just a few blocks away from Elena. We spent every day together, cooking, talking, and slowly rebuilding the bond that was stolen from us. It was not always easy. There were days of deep grief and anger, but we navigated them together. I finally had my mother, my real mother, and the love I felt from her was pure, untainted by lies. Looking back on that day in the lawyer's office, I realized that the brass key did not just open a wooden box, it unlocked the cage I had been living in my entire life. It destroyed my past, but it gave me my future. I learned that the truth, no matter how brutal and earth-shattering it may be, is always better than living a comfortable lie. Blood does not make a family, but honesty and unconditional love do. I lost the parents I thought I had, but I found the woman who gave me life, and I found myself in the process. Have you ever discovered a hidden truth about your family that completely changed the way you view your own history? And if you were in my shoes, would you have confronted the people who raised you or walked away in silence? Until the next story.